So where was I? It's the first time that's actually happened in all these videos that I'm shooting is that the phone rang. But you know, I got to be ready to answer the phone. So that's why I put the office hours up. But timing is everything. So we're just going to continue this, and we're going to go through the types of basic tissues that you find in animals. Epithelial tissue, or epithelium, oops. Is one feature of epithelial tissue is the tissue faces a space. Now the reason I have that in quotes is that the spaces are not always particularly evident. Is that, you know, pretty obvious this is facing a space. Pretty obvious those two layers of the intestine is facing the inside space and the outside space of the abdominal cavity. But epithelial tissue performs a number of functions where when you look at it under a microscope, you don't really see the spaces. The spaces are there, but they're so tight that layers that the cells look like they're actually up against one another and connected, they're actually not. As I said, we're not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Epithelium can be multiple layers, or as was in the intestine, it could be a single layer. The outer layer of the intestine is a single layer of cells. The inner layer is a single layer of cells. The outer layer of the intestine, the cells are very flat. The inner layer, the cells are very tall and skinny and packed in together. That's actually called columnar, and the flat stuff are called squamous. We're not dealing with that yet. And they also come stumpy, what they call cuboidal, which are basically squarish cells. So every shape you can think that you put on cells together to make a lining, you can find them. And you can find single layers and multiple layers, and then weird things like the layers on the inside of a bladder, where if the bladder's completely full, the outer, it looks like there's just one layer. But when the bladder empties, the layers fold up over one another and under a microscope look like there's a bunch of layers. Whereas there's all, again, not connected to each other, but they look like there's several layers. The epithelium can be protective. People tend to always want to make, you know, when we talk about this, when we do the lab, one of the things I ask in the lab is, okay, there's epithelium in an intestine, what's it there for? And they go, well, the outer epithelium is there for protection. Really? You really think that your liver is about to attack your intestines and it needs protection from that? It isn't protective, it's just an edge. The inner one is protective, but it's protective in a weird way where it's protecting you from your own digestive juices. If you think of your esophagus, you have an outer edge and an inner layer that's just an edge on the inside because it doesn't really protect you against food being swallowed. Secretion. Glands are packets of epithelium. And under a microscope, they look very blobby, but they don't look like they have spaces really between the cells, but they do. And you've got a surface. A lot of surfaces are going to absorb materials: digestive surfaces, urinary surfaces, respiratory surfaces. So this is all part of the part of the package that comes with surfaces. Now the unfortunately named connective tissue connective tissue are cells that live in a material that isn't cellular. a non-living matrix, is what they call it. And even then, they don't always apply those rules properly. Some books only consider connective tissue to be cells that live in a matrix that they themselves make. So bone is a connective tissue, the cells in bone make the bone. Cartilage is connective tissue, the cells in cartilage make the cartilage. Now, if you don't apply that, blood is a connective tissue, because the cells in the blood are living in plasma, but they don't make the plasma. And my definition is I don't insist that the cells be able to make the matrix, or you wind up with some tissues that just don't go in any of the categories. So it's just a matter of definition for convenience. Doesn't always connect stuff. That's why it's a terrible term. But it does tend to produce structure. The projections in the intestine have that structure because of connective tissue in the core. Your bones and your cartilage and your ligaments and your tendons, the things that hold your skeleton together, are structural. But it's not always true. Right? Blood's not structural. Fat is a connective tissue. I couldn't tell you why, because the cells, the fat are not around the cells, the fat's actually inside the cells in this humongous space. But it's always considered on the lists for connective tissue. So again, it's biology, medicine to some extent. You're gonna find weird stretches of the definitions in order to fit things in. At least the fat cells do actually make the fat. Epithelial tissue, so we've got, oops, I'm trying to do this so that I'm using my shadow here. We've got the epithelial tissue in many, many layers in your skin. Now, depending on where you're looking at skin, there aren't always this many layers. On parts of your skin that don't tend to have a lot of abrasion, there may only be 1 or 2 layers. On parts of your skin where there's a lot of abrasion, there could be 60 or 70 layers. It also turns out that one of the features of epithelium that we're not going to talk about now, but it's here, is it sits on a shared membrane, what they call a basement membrane. And so there's a couple of other things. Blood vessels don't run through epithelium typically. So there are other features that we're going to get into when we get into more detail in the second semester that make epithelium. Connective tissue, the loose stuff that holds your skin down is full of collagen fibers. Here's fat. Remember I said the droplets are actually inside the cells. You can see they're inside the cells. Fat is called adipose tissue. This one does consider blood to be a connective tissue. The plasma would be the matrix. In muscles, there's long strands of muscle cells, but there are strands of connective tissue around it. And eventually there's a sheath, a coating around the muscle that eventually there's less and less muscle and more connective tissue. And then you have a tendon, the cable that holds your muscle to the bone that it's pulling on. Cartilage, cells in a matrix that's very plasticky, and bone, which is cells inside a bony matrix. Because this is very, very dense, there's a lot of connecting canals here so that oxygen and nutrients can get into the cells and waste materials can get out of the cells. But this is all connective tissue, various types of connective tissue. And in us, this is pretty much the list. Before I go on with writing, I'll go to the next tissue so I can put this up here. Muscle tissue. There are 3 basic types of muscle tissue. There's skeletal muscle, which is what you would expect. It pulls on your skeleton. The cells are long and multinucleated. They don't start that way. They start as a string of cells, but if you have a long string of cells with a membrane between the nuclei, that membrane becomes a weak point for pulling on, And so these all fuse together and become what's called a syncytium, a term you'll need to know in the second semester. And these run the full length of a muscle. Cardiac muscle, because it doesn't connect, from one tendon to the next, the way that a skeletal muscle does, but it wraps around a pumping chamber. The cells are branched, and they are connected to one another with these very tight zipper connections called intercalated discs. But they set up a system that wraps around a chamber pretty well. Smooth muscle tends to exist as kind of sheets. The muscles are long and pointy and not fused together. They don't have a huge amount of power, but they're good for pushing things along that don't take a lot of power, but you need to always have going, like the linings of your intestine or the breathing tubes that you open and close to adjust airflow in your respiratory system. Now, there is a fourth type of muscle that isn't on this overhead that you only find in flying insects. That's called fibrillar muscle. That is skeletal muscle, but it's a very specialized type of skeletal muscle. So that'll wind up on our list. But I don't have an overhead for it. Muscle cells can get shorter. They can purposely get shorter. And that's the function. Epithelium is mostly defined by its physical setup. Connective tissue is mostly defined by its physical setup. Muscle is defined by its functional setup, what it can do. Nervous tissue, the next one, is defined by what it can do. Reproductive tissue, defined by what it can do. Okay, I'm going to be a pain in the butt here. I am going to go through this pretty quickly, but you may want to go back and look at the stuff I was saying when I had the overhead up there. Skeletal, strong, pulls skeletal elements, needs a lot of oxygen and nutrients. Generally under what we would consider conscious control, your brain decides what muscles need to contract when in order for you to move under some control. Conscious control isn't as conscious as the word suggests, and unconscious control isn't as strong as the word suggests. But cardiac and smooth muscle are considered to be under unconscious control. Your brain is still telling things when to contract, but it's not a decision you're making. Like right now, the words that are coming out of my mouth, my brain is deciding what muscles need to fire in order to make those words happen. Whereas my brain is controlling my heartbeat for sure, but I'm not thinking about speed up, slow down, speed up, slow down. Same thing for my breathing and same thing for the movement of food through my intestines. So long strings of multinucleated fused cells, branched, zipped together cells. One thing I forgot was up on the overhead. See the stripes? See the no stripes? These are called striations. It's kind of an amazing thing. The molecules in here, there's little lines that are anchors. And then there's molecules that stick out from the anchors and with a space in between them. And when the muscle contracts, it pulls the anchors in. And the stripes disappear because these things overlap one another. Is that literally there's two molecules here and there's another molecule resting kind of above it. So in an overlap point, you get a dark stripe. Overlap point, you get a dark stripe. Get a light stripe near the anchor, get a light stripe in the middle until everything pulls together, and then it gets all, the stripes change position and they get darker. And the strong muscles, the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle are striated. The not so strong muscles are not striated. They do have the same muscle fibers in there, but they're not organized. This is an amazingly organized system where you can actually see how the molecules are arranged by looking at the stripes. Fibrillar muscle is also striated muscle. So skeletal and cardiac and fibrillar are all striated muscle. Smooth muscle is not. Smooth muscle typically in sheets, but of course, if your intestine is a sheet curled up into a tube. Your respiratory tubes are a sheet curled up into a tube. Your arteries are sheets curled up into a tube. They also have smooth muscle and it helps pump the blood along. Skeletal, long and thin strands that connect one point to another. Fibrillar, which drives wings, also, anchored in the body wall and attach actually to another spot in the body wall. We're not going to get into that. But what makes fibrillar not completely skeletal is an adaptation to make wings beat really quickly in insects. Typically, these things contract when they get a message down. The nerves contract, they contract. And then there's a short recovery period, both for the nerves and for the muscle, where the muscle needs to be stretched back out. But the nerves you can't pile too many nerve impulses on top of one another because the nerves need to recover. Fibrillar muscle needs to contract faster than that. Contract, relax, contract, relax, contract, relaxed. And so what fibrillar muscle does is you send a nerve impulse to it and it goes like 6 times between then and the next nerve impulse. So it can contract multiple times on a single nerve input. And that's what makes it different from the other ones. And that's what makes a mosquito able to beat its wings 1,100 times a second when they get close to you. Now, in some animals, you get these weird combinations of these subtypes. In invertebrates in our group, they tend to be pretty distinctively separate, but in other animals, you'll get smooth and striated combinations for some things. Nervous tissue, capable of producing electrochemical signals. You have nerves. Again, second semester, we'll talk about how these things fire. It involves ionic movement out of the membrane and then quickly back through the membrane. You have these wrapping cells in us, invertebrates, that kind of hold that space next to the nerve membrane tight so that you get a very rapid depolarization of the membrane. And the impulses actually go faster here and then slow down and faster and slow down, faster and slow down. They kind of jump. And this is called a myelin sheath. Myelin is a type of protein. You don't need to know that. But what travels down a nerve is an electrochemical impulse. It's electricity, but it's chemical. It's basically gates opening and slamming and ions flooding through the membrane, which means that a nerve impulse is in a particular place, moving at a particular speed. And the speed is set up by the setup of the nerve. Is that any given nerve has a speed that it hits, and it can't go any faster, and it can't go any slower, and it has a certain recovery period. In a lot of non-vertebrates, instead of having the wrapping, the insulation on the nerves, they have big nerves, more membrane, quicker impulses. So they can adjust the speed of the impulse by adjusting the size of the dendrite. Is that the dendrite and the axons, dendrite and axon, incoming, outgoing, there's a supporting cell body on a nerve cell. For a long time, they were trying to get rid of these designations because not all nervous systems have a clear input-output system. Some of them are bidirectional, where the impulses could go both directions depending on what's going on with the nervous system. But that's pretty unusual, and it's in some parts of the animal world that nobody really pays any attention to. So they were going to try to call them all axons, but it apparently didn't catch on. It's what I learned when I learned about invertebrate zoology, but nobody teaches it anymore. But you may run into it in an old book. Now, obviously, you got this whole communication issue going on in nervous systems, and so nervous tissue is a big deal there. But also, your sensory system takes input from the environment that sets off the receptor, light, colors, movement, molecules on your nasal epithelium, molecules on the surface of your tongue, molecules released by damaged cells, setting off pain receptors, all sorts of things. And what they can do is fire an electrochemical signal that goes to the processors that say pain, smell, taste, sight, this type of sight. And so they're part of your nervous tissue. They initiate electrochemical signals, and then they travel in along the system. In most animals, the cells from one point to the next point along the sequence are not actually in contact with one another. So the impulse doesn't just go in and keep going because it's a membrane-based thing. There's a tiny gap, really tiny. That's called a synapse. And in order for the impulse to get across the synapse, it has to cause the release of molecules into the gap that connect to receptors on the other side. So the electricity doesn't jump the gap, but these chemical signals go across and go, okay, if we can set off enough receptors over here, you can control the transmission by scarfing these things up before they get across. And sometimes you can magnify the signal. Sometimes the signals don't just go from one cell to the next, but to a whole area. Your brain works that way, where it releases neurotransmitters into an area and fires off a bunch of cells. But so it isn't purely electrochemical, it's also transmitting protein chemicals between these gaps. And as I said, there are some animals where the nerve cells really are attached to the next nerve cell. And it's like, these are like having potential switches in the system that you could switch on and switch off. The other ones are kind of hardwired. Reproductive isn't always considered a tissue, and it gets different names. Is that the old name was stem tissue, but with stem cells, they've kind of gotten away from that because stem cells and stem tissue are not the same thing. Sometimes you hear it called germ tissue. That's an even older one. Typically, when it is considered a separate tissue, it's reproductive tissue. And these are cells that can produce sex cells that are meiosis producing. They can take two sets of chromosomes, reduce it to one, and the sex cells themselves are typically considered reproductive tissue. This is very specialized. Some books consider it to be a function of a specialized type of epithelium, so not all books consider a fifth tissue in animals. They may consider just the four tissues. Because of the interruption of the phone, I've had to break this up differently. I don't have a lot left to do, but this is how I see the number on my screen. But I don't want to get any further in, so the next video is going to be pretty doggone short.